They expected fists, they expected jeers, and they expected a language they couldn't understand. But what cut through the silence was their own mother tongue. In 1944, as World War II raged across continents, over 400,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner and sent across the Atlantic to American soil. From battle-hardened veterans to young conscripts, they arrived in the United States expecting humiliation, hostility, and the dehumanizing coldness of captivity. Instead, they were met with something far more disorienting. American guards who spoke fluent German. Not broken words, not rehearsed commands, but fluent, native-level speech, some even delivered in familiar regional dialects. It was the first psychological blow they never saw coming. A moment of eerie recognition that felt more like a trap than a comfort. How could the enemy sound like home? This wasn't an accident. It was strategy, a tactic more subtle than bullets and far more unsettling than barbed wire. Language had become a weapon, a silent, penetrating weapon. But who were these guards? How could they speak German so well? And why were they chosen to stand on this front line of the war? That's where the real story begins.
Achtung! Stillgestanden!
Before the war even began, the United States had already started preparing for a different kind of battle. A quiet recruitment had been underway, not of soldiers but of speakers, men who had fled Nazi Germany, refugees, immigrants, dissidents, German-born, but now American by choice and by necessity. These were not ordinary interpreters. They were selected, trained, and deployed as weapons of psychological warfare. They knew the language, yes, but they also knew the culture, the rhythms, the idioms, the dialects, the very soul of what it meant to be German. And now, in American uniforms, they stood across from their former countrymen, speaking with perfect fluency from the other side of the war. For many, it was a deeply personal mission. Some had lost family to Hitler's regime. Others had fled before they could be drafted into the army they now interrogated. They carried memories, guilt, anger, and a fierce desire to fight tyranny, not with bullets, but with words. Their battlefield was not in the trenches. It was behind the fences, inside the minds of prisoners who still believed in the Reich. And their base of operations? A secretive place known as Fort Hunt. Hidden behind civilian facades in Virginia, Fort Hunt became the heart of America's psychological war effort. It trained not just translators, but linguistic tacticians, men who could disarm a prisoner's defenses without ever raising their voice. No shouting, no torture, just questions, delivered in the language of childhood, in the tone of familiarity, a weapon disguised as conversation. They didn't wear their past on their sleeves, but it lived in their voices, and soon those voices would echo through the camps.
Our objective is to extract critical intelligence from these high-value targets. Remember, every detail matters.
At first, they thought it was a trick. Some believed it was a hallucination, the side effect of hunger, fear, and weeks of marching. But it was real. The enemy was speaking. Perfect German, not just commands, not just instructions, but stories, questions, conversations that sounded like they were coming from a neighbor back home. It shook the very core of the prisoners' identities. Some wept, overcome by the familiarity, by the unbearable closeness of what should have been foreign. Others recoiled, angry, betrayed, unable to comprehend how the enemy could sound like family. They looked at the guards with suspicion. Were these men truly Americans? Or had something even stranger happened? The camps, once governed by rigid silence and foreignness, began to shift. Suddenly, language didn't divide, it pierced. It got inside, Simple greetings turned into cautious conversations. Polite questions led to long, disarming talks. And in the interrogation rooms, where fear once dominated, something unexpected took root. Trust. Not the kind forged through friendship, but the kind coaxed from confusion, fatigue, and humanity.
We are ready for deployment.
One former interrogator from Fort Hunt later recalled, "We made them believe they didn't have to suffer anymore. They just had to tell the truth." No shouting, no violence, just words, delivered in the right voice at the right time. It was the kind of warfare that left no scars on the skin, but rewired the soul. At first, the language brought comfort. It reminded the prisoners of home, of their childhoods, of a world before war. But as days turned into weeks, something else began to take hold. Division, suspicion, fear. Within the camps, two factions quietly formed. There were those who responded to the guards' fluent German with cooperation, some even with gratitude. They believed in decency, in the possibility of dignity even in captivity.
I am writing to you today.
And then there were the others, hardliners, loyalists to the Nazi regime. To them, kindness was a trap, words were weapons, and anyone who softened, anyone who spoke too freely, was seen as a traitor. Small groups began to monitor the conversations of fellow prisoners. Whispers turned into accusations, and in the shadows of the barracks, punishments were carried out, not by the guards, but by other prisoners. The language that once united them now divided them. A prisoner would hear his hometown dialect, and instead of comfort, he felt fear. "He speaks like my brother, but is he still my brother?" Letters, once a lifeline to home, became another source of dread. Every word written in German was read, analyzed, and, if necessary, redacted. Not by strangers, but by guards who understood every nuance, every expression of doubt. Privacy vanished. So did trust. Many prisoners began to censor themselves, not only in letters, but in thought. They feared their accents, their slips of emotion, even their dreams. Some didn't just fear others. They began to fear themselves. The barbed wire no longer defined the prison. The prison had moved inside.
Is that all of it?
Is that all of it?
I think so.
Someone's coming.
Years later, when the war was over and the fences had long come down, many former German prisoners were asked what they remembered most. Not the barbed wire, not the guard towers, not even the fear. What lingered was the voice of the man who watched over them. "He spoke like my father," one former POW said. Same tone, same accent. For a moment, I forgot I was a prisoner. For many, this dissonance became the most lasting scar. Because if the enemy could sound like family,
Please help me.
then what did that make them? Were they soldiers? Were they captives? Or were they simply men caught between languages, loyalties, and lies? Language had become more than communication. It had become the battleground for identity itself. In those camps, German was no longer just a mother tongue. It was a mirror, one that showed them not just their captors, but their own reflections. And for some, that realization was freeing. For others, unbearable. What the Americans had done was subtle, almost invisible. They didn't use language to dominate. They used it to dismantle certainty, to blur the line between enemy and human. Was it compassion or control? Was it empathy or psychological warfare in its most elegant form? That question still haunts the history books, because sometimes the most effective weapon sounds just like home. The war was over. The barbed wire would soon be torn down. And the prisoners, men once called the enemy, were going home. But before the gates opened, before the trucks rolled out, something quiet and unforgettable happened. A handshake between a German prisoner and an American guard, and then, spoken in soft, perfect German. Gute Reise, safe journey. That was the last thing he heard inside the camp. Not an order, not a threat, but a farewell, spoken in the language of memory. For many former prisoners, that moment never left them, because in that instant, language was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. What began as a tactic ended as something far more powerful. Recognition, not of sides, but of selves. Two men, divided by war, bound by a shared tongue. Today, we live in a world where battles are often fought with beliefs, not bullets, where conflict spreads through misunderstanding and silence, not always through violence. So the question remains, can the lessons of that strange, quiet battlefield, the one fought with language, still guide us? Can we listen before we label? Can we speak in ways that disarm hate? Can we remember that sometimes the most powerful message we can offer isn't shouted? It's spoken gently, in a voice the other side can understand. Because maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the end of the story.